when Europeans, let's say, went to Africa to enslave people, they were not simply going to capture or buy or steal slaves. They were going there to capture people who were the experts, who were the folks who were dedicated, people who were wise, people who were skillful in every aspect of human culture. They would go there to take people who were the rice farmers.
Welcome back to Black Stories, where we go beyond the pages of textbooks and into the hearts and voices of those who lived the history. Too often, we think we know the black history in America because we've read it. But what we've read has been selected, has been censored and sanitized to fit the shelf, not always to tell the truth. But what if you could hear the truth firsthand?
Dr. G. Real stories, real people, unpacking the struggles, reclaiming the narratives with Dr. G.
Today I have the deep honor of sitting with Elder Jim Embry, a civil rights icon, an environmental justice warrior, an educator, and a living library of black struggles, resistance, and resilience. From marching at just 14 years old to attending Dr. King's funeral and also participating as a funeral marshal in 1968, to redefining sustainability through the lens of justice and food sovereignty, Elder Embry has lived the very history that many of us only read about.
Elder Embry, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your wisdom with us.
Certainly.
My next question to you is, I know that you've led efforts in sustainable agriculture and food justice for so many years. Can you please talk about the deep connection between gardening, healing, and liberation, especially in black communities?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that question. And you're asking, I must say, some really significant questions. Very meaningful, very insightful. I get interviewed a lot, and oftentimes I wonder, the person who's interviewing me, what they know or what they don't know, because sometimes their questions are kind of mediocre, they're superficial, and they're aren't the kind of questions I would prefer to respond to. So sometimes I will take a question they've asked me. I said, that question is based upon this old way of thinking. Okay? I won't answer it, but I will respond to this. But with yours, all of your questions are great. So, I would begin with, so my legacy within what we call food activism, sustainability, and that whole intersect began before I was born. Okay? Again, I was, I say I'm the proud progeny of folks who were formerly enslaved Africans coming largely out of Nigeria, as we have understood, out of the Igbo people is where we come from. And then we were brought to the Virginia area around mid-1700s, we think. We have records back to 1790 in Virginia, and we were brought across the Appalachian Mountains or around 1800 into Kentucky. But we recognize that when Europeans, let's say, went to Africa to enslave people, they were not simply going to capture or buy or steal slaves. They were going there to capture people who were the experts, who were the folks who were dedicated, people who were wise, people who were skillful in every aspect of human culture. They would go there to take people who were the rice farmers and bring them to the Carolinas to help build the rice farming culture in the Carolinas. They would go and steal people who were the horse whisperers, the people who were breeding horses and had a long thousands of years of culture around humans' interaction with horses. They would go and get those people, those folk, and bring them over and then help, and then put them in charge of the thoroughbred racing culture in Virginia before it came to Kentucky. So the point is that it's almost like you're going into a department store and you're not just buying stuff willy-nilly with no thought. You're going in and you're picking out particular items that you can use when you come back home or when you come to the Americas. So within that context, there was an effort to bring people from the continent that were skilled in agriculture, skilled in foodways, to come over and work in the plantations or work in the farming communities. And of course, people came with thousands of years of history, thousands of years of cultural reference points around what we call agriculture and foodways. But in the continent, agriculture and the production of food wasn't separated from religion. It wasn't separated from the work of women. It wasn't separate from dancing. It wasn't separated from drumming and music. It wasn't separated from how you viewed the cosmos and the stars. These things were all interrelated, but because beyond breathing air and drinking water, the third most essential item that humans must do every day is eat, which means agriculture, food. And I think in the African cosmology, we understood these things were all interrelated, they were all synergistic, and they weren't separate. You know, our religions were based upon rituals honoring harvest, honoring the earth, honoring soil, honoring the water, honoring the mountains, honoring the cosmos, was how we connected agriculture and foodways. They weren't separate. But so the point is that those reference points is what I believe that my ancestors came with and gifted to me there in Kentucky. That kind of African cosmology. We came over to Kentucky and we learned the flora and the fauna of the land. We learned, we had experiences with indigenous people, Native American, Indian, however you want to call it. We interacted with those folks in the Appalachian region. We learned the indigenous people's cosmology, their history of seeds and agriculture and medicinal herbs and the flora and the fauna. And they learned to love the land, and they learned to recognize the native plants and things in those areas. Of course, as we know as well, especially African women would hide seeds in their hair, crossing the Atlantic to ensure that they're taking these African connections with food and seeds with them in the journey to wherever they were going. There's a whole history of those kind of things happening. Language was preserved about foodways, plants, and whatever else. So I think that So in my growing up and going out to the farms that my grandparents, uncles, and aunts lived on as I was growing up, we would go out and have these not only connections with family, but connections with food, and we were immersed in both the production of food. And again, when I was growing up, and I was born in '49, those foods were all grown organically. That women, we know, gave us the gift of agriculture some 15,000 years ago. It was the gift of women, not men. Men were out oftentimes hunting and bringing nothing back home. They were out gathering at times, bringing nothing back home. The women said, well, hell, we got babies to feed, we got mouths to feed. You all come back, sometimes with food, and we're grateful, sometimes with no food. Sometimes you go out and don't even come back. Your ass got ate up by somebody, okay? So what are we going to do to make sure that we're feeding our babies and feeding our community? And out of that came the development of what we call agriculture, the gift of women. And so those are the kinds of, I think, sensibilities that I was around in growing up in Kentucky. As I was saying, up until the years after World War II, then humans farmed what we call organically for all those thousands of years. So what we call organic agriculture, or whether it was regenerative agriculture or permaculture or whatever words we use, agroecology, that's how humans farmed for the first 15,000 years that we developed agriculture. It was only at the advent of World War II, when we came back from the wars, especially the United States, with all these chemical weapons that we were using in the war, and those chemical weapons got turned into fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides. So we turned the weapons of war, okay, all these chemical weapons into, then we convinced farmers and food growers you should give up these traditional ways of growing things organically, okay? And now you need all these chemical inputs, all these fertilizers, okay, all these pesticides and whatever else, and now we have a war on the environment. We're going to pollute the air, pollute the soil, pollute people who are eating it, pollute the animals. It's a war, and I call that the Great Experiment. And what it says is that if we as these corporate, predators, these corporate elites, these corporate owners say, okay, if we fill the air full of chemicals, if we fill the water full of chemicals, if we fill the soil full of chemicals, if we fill human beings and other parts of the natural world full of chemicals, will they survive? It's a great experiment. So my work has been about being grounded in my traditions of how farming was done on our family farms. Again, and they were done largely, okay, without chemical input. We used the poop from the chickens and the poop from the cows and the poop from the hogs and the muck from the forest and the leaves and the compost is what we used on our farm. That's how I grew up. And again, by and large, on our farms, we had orchards. Again, 9% of what we ate probably came from the farm. Okay, it's how I grew up. And I say, I don't know any better. It's just how I grew up. I don't know no better than that. Okay. But also, there was a great amount of collaboration, cooperation, what we call quilt making. And it wasn't just the making of quilts. In the house I live in now, in my living room, it's where largely the women, my moms, aunts, grandparents would all gather and with pieces of cloth and make quilts. But quilt making was also how you built the barn together. Quilt making was also how you practice your religious church services together. And our farm had a pond. It was used as a baptismal place for the community around us. Down the street was a school that my grandfather taught school that my mom went to school at. So quilt making was a community fabric, and I believe those were kinds of traditions and cultural ways that were African cultural ways And we didn't just learn them from Europeans, okay? That's not how we developed them at all. But we knew from that longer lens of coming out of the African peoples what was important for our sense of humanity. And it meant working together in community, helping each other. My grandfather, DB's sister, was the midwife and the herbal healer for her community. And she learned that probably from her mother or her grandmother or her great-grandmother. And chances are, if we were to track that line of matrilineal line back to the continent, chances are the great-great-great-great-great-grandmama over there in Nigeria, Igbo land, was the area midwife, okay? Those traditions get carried on, okay, forward, I believe. Those ancestral vibrations, okay, lived. Strangely enough, that just a side story if I can share. When we were having kids, we had a friend who was Nigerian, and he was also a linguist. He helped us understand the African naming ceremonies and African naming rituals and whatever. He helped us name all the kids, and all the kids have these Yoruba and Hebrew names coming out of Nigeria because he was from there. And all of them have meaning, behind the names and that kind of thing. And then as I was using Ancestry DNA about 6 years ago and got my swab of DNA from my jaw and sent it in, then I got back the report that kind of laid out where my people were from. And about 50% of that lineage was from Nigeria. I said, wow. And then 3 years ago, I helped to host a Nigerian king who came to Kentucky, and he was part of the Igbo people. And he came over and said, yeah, well, I've been researching on REM about you people in Kentucky, and you people here in Kentucky that I've been researching largely came from Nigeria and from the Igbo people. He said to me, I have come to reclaim my people. I'm thinking now, damn, Nigerian king comes over, identifying me by how I look. I get my DNA that says you're from. How did our friend, who I think his name was Adewale Oak, how did he know? And he didn't know. These are ancestral vibrations saying your ass came from Nigeria, and we're gonna make damn sure we send someone along who will help you name your folk. So I'm saying those kind of vibrations are the kind of things that we need to reconnect with, reaffirm with, and how they show up. They showed up, okay, in my family legacy on our farms that we have, and it shows up in my work. I can't pretend that what I do now, I don't know any better, okay. My folk were people who kept seeds, and they had a great farm diversity. They ate what was off the land. They loved the land, and they knew all the damn trees. They knew all the plants. They knew everything was medicinal. And what we're doing now with our urban farms and doing, these foraging walks and growing and having diversification is what our people were doing. It's what our people were doing, especially post the Civil War. That's how we. Those were the contributions that we gave, and we say with George Washington Carver and his devotion to what I call saving black souls, meaning black folk, black farmers, and black soil, that Carver came along like the black farmers in the Civil War, and Carver once again saved the nation because the South was being destroyed, being degraded with all the emphasis on cotton and one crops, using all kinds of fertilizers and all kinds of chemical inputs. The Dust Bowl was occurring, okay, and the Southern agricultural system was collapsing. Carver comes along with his sensibilities, and he was borrowing a lot. Again, even though he went to Iowa State, even though he was raised by a white family, his Africanness, his African cosmology, his African sensibility was showing up, okay, and him talking to the plants, talking to the peanut plants, Those were African vibrations emerging in his life. He didn't learn those from the European. At Iowa State, he was learning out there about the using of these new things called chemical inputs and whatever else. He got to Tuskegee, and he pretty much disavowed that part of his training. And he was essentially manifesting. He was emanating. He was actualizing these ancestral vibrations that were coming through him at Tuskegee. That's why he stayed there. He was offered a job by Edison. I'll pay you $100,000 a year to come work in my laboratory. He was offered a job by Ford. Come up here, I'll pay you $100,000 a year. He said, no, I can't forego my people. I cannot abandon my people. I cannot come up here and be a big dog and be in the Ford Motor Company and do all the biddings of you corporate giants. My devotion is to my people. And my people means the actual human people. People also meant the plants, the soil, the flora, and the fauna. He understood were also his people. His ancestral vibrations told him, man, yo folk back in the continent talk to the trees, talk to the mountains, talk to the rivers. They knew how to do all that, and you can too. That's part of our work.
What have these experiences taught you about the global movement for environmental justice?
Absolutely. I will say that, again, I didn't quite realize when I was growing up, because more that I researched and read about our people who were, again, emancipated post-Civil War. Du Bois called it Black Reconstruction. Okay, and Booker T. Washington wrote the book, Up from Slavery. But it was about our people being able to take where we were and these ancestral, cultural, food and agricultural ways and utilize them in the South. Okay? And part of that meant that they understood that they couldn't go out individually and get a farm. You'd be burned down, you'd be run off the farm, you'd be killed. They knew that they had to come together in communities. Okay? And most of them were these rural black communities. They knew that their survivability wasn't going to be based upon you go out by yourself and get a farm. No, we come together, we create a space, okay, where we have a church, we got a school, we got businesses, we got blacksmith shop, we got midwives, we got herbal healers. We have what we need right there in community. But they also have relationships with people beyond the community. They had connections with, they had networks with, they had associations with other black folk throughout the South, black folk in the North, okay? And they were also part of this global network as it existed back in the 1800s, 1900s, okay? They were part of that whole understanding because they understood that we must know about things on our farm, our local areas. We must know about things happening throughout the South, things happening nationally, and we also want to be aware of and connected with things happening internationally. So as I've researched both the rural and the urban black folk in Kentucky, some of those, like I have records of some of the women who belonged to what was called the NACW, National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. They were going to Europe for women's suffrage conferences. Okay, they were aware of the various things happening in the Caribbean, happening in the continent of the African continent, because they were reading all these black publications. They were reading, the newspapers. They were reading the magazines. They were sending word back and forth. If you worked for the railroad and you were a Pullman Pullman porter, then you were carrying messages, okay, as you were traveling about world affairs, because you were overhearing maybe the white folk on the train talking about these things, okay. Plus, you would have during the Spanish-American War, you had again black folk who were fighting in the Caribbean, okay. Spanish-American War, you had folk who were in World War I, World War II, who were traveling internationally and bringing back these international news, international relationships that were being forged. You had black people who were fighting in Spain with the Spanish Revolution. Okay, you had Paul Robeson, traveling around the world in 30 different countries, speaking 20 different languages. So the point is that so I was growing up in that kind of a family legacy, where on our tabletop were various, we called them black magazines, black newspapers, and we had people that we were connected with in the civil rights movement, whether it was CORE, NAACP, later on in college, helped found the Black Student Union, was part of SNCC, was part of all the African liberation movements. So I've had this sensibility of international connections and the importance of international relationships. I mentioned that a friend of ours, in 71 helped us name our kids. We had friends who were students from different parts of the world. So then going to Cuba, okay, and going to Brazil and going to Italy 8 times and is an extension of that kind of a sensibility. But again, I was just fortunate to have been in a family culture of what I call people who were agrarian intellectual activists. Okay, when I think about my work around George Washington Carver, I learned about how he was friends with Gandhi in India, and they were corresponding, and Gandhi was impressed with having read about this. There's this black scientist over there in the United States who's working over there with black peasants. I'm working over here with brown peasants. He's over there designing all kinds of plant-based stuff to eat, and over here we need more of that. So they were corresponding. That's why King adopted the Gandhian nonviolent philosophy, because of Carver. Carver was entertaining emissaries from Gandhi, and then Carver sent over a guy named Howard Thurman, who was a theologian, to meet with Gandhi, and then the guy Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, went to India to study with Gandhi. He came back over, and then he whispered to Dr. King, "There's a guy over there, okay, in India that Carver knows that you ought to hook up with," and that happened. So the idea again of international relations has been part of our culture. Oftentimes, when I'd say enslaved Africans were able to commandeer and take over a ship and escape, some of them went back to Africa. Some went to the Caribbean and said, "Well, we're going to go down here and create a colony." Okay, so we've had this. Again, Africans have been sailing the seas for thousands of years, long before Europeans went out. Okay, they were out interacting, all over the world. So we've had this sense of what we call international vibrations of interest and cultural exchange. It's been part of who we are as a people. I'm just kind of following in that kind of a tradition, but we realize that around the question of food and agriculture, that it's always been. I mean, we've had seeds. There's some type of a squash, a gourd. It's called an African gourd, African squash, that by itself, not with any ship, just floated, okay, all the way over to the Americas and began to implant itself in the Americas. So we've had this wonderful exchange of food in all kinds of ways. The peanut, was begun in South America. Then Europeans, Spanish took it to Europe. Europeans didn't like it. When the Spanish took it to Africa, the Africans loved it because it reminded them of ground nut. Brought it over here and became, part of the whole Southern foodways and part of the work of Carver. And the black troops in the Civil War carried these rations of peanuts. They knew they were high in nourishment and could sustain them over long marches or whatever else. There's a whole, peanut association that's international in its sense. So what we're saying now is that if we're trying to create peace in our communities, and peace has to do also with health. In my view, the human body is a sacred temple, and we're meant to put into it sacred things, the best of things. And peace means living a life where you're not always caught up in disease and all kinds of health problems and having to have new knees and new hips and new whatever. That isn't the highest level of peace. The highest level of peace is to be healthy for the long term. The long term ought to be a central element of peace, and peace ought to mean you ought to be bringing into your body elements that are nutritious, that are healthy. If you're bringing in all this trash stuff, processed stuff that shouldn't even be called food, that's an act of violence against your body. And you want to act to your body towards peace. And you want to bring in the very best of food sources, the very best of water, the very best of air. Is an act of the sense of your own personal sense of peace and the sense of longevity and good health. But we recognize that this food and ag system that needs to be changed so radically has global implications. Okay, that the military, our U.S. military, that has bases around the world, they're largely there to protect the interests of the big corporations, and most of those are about agricultural products. They're trying to protect international trade. They're trying to protect the wealth and profits of the big corporations. So we need to have these international networks. When I went to Cuba in 2000, I think it was 4, that was when Fidel Castro was still living. And part of our going there, part of the point of interest out of Detroit was to extend our work around urban farming. And we were reading and following from the video that Cuba was one of the leading countries around how they were utilizing urban farming, urban agriculture as a point of principle for their country. And we went there, had a great time. They were there 2 weeks. We were in Fidel's presence 3 times. We got to visit hospitals and factories and saw young people. And then we saw signs, again, the idea of peace. We saw signs saying, support the revolution. Saw signs saying, go serve your community. Signs saying, do urban farming. Signs saying, the way the future is organic agriculture. There were no signs over there promoting the fast food joints, the processed food. There were no signs promoting smoking. None of that. It was about promoting health. And they maintained that agriculture is organic, is the first pathway for good health. So I've been blessed again to go to Brazil for the World Social Forum, and over there studied their elements of the landless workers movement, the idea of land, going to Italy for the Terra Madre gathering, meaning Mother Earth, and the new face of Terra Madre, a young brother named Eddie McKeeby, who's from Uganda. He's the face of now international slow food and international Terra Madre. When we go there, when Jennifer and I went there last year, we were able to interact with people from 35 African countries, and we go around and speak, and we do about 20 or 30 talks a year, like we're here in the Twin Cities. And we were telling Melvin Giles and the Children's Garden crew last night that you all need to be present next year in Italy at the Terra Madre gathering. Yes, you need to work here in the Twin Cities with these great urban farms, but our work has to also have a global dimension, and the Terra Madre movement is the most radical, revolutionary, transformative network movement going on the earth now, in my opinion, because it's all based upon food and ag, and it means bringing in the common people. It means this idea of promoting seed diversity. It means the idea of forming seed networks. It means forming these international networks of small farmers and chefs, people like that, the fisher people. It's a tremendous movement. So yeah, it's important that, and the way they began to dismantle these larger multinational corporations that want to control, and they do control, the world market of food, agriculture, seeds, and technology, is to create resilience based upon how well are we creating on every block. During the World War I and World War II, there was a thing called victory gardens that George Washington Carver inspired. There were gardens everywhere. So the idea of her having this garden here isn't anything new. It's a great remembering of how during the war we recognized there was men fighting in Europe, let's say, and off the farm. We had to find some way to produce food. So largely then women and young people were charged with these victory gardens, and they were some of the farms were 9 and 10 acres. Okay, so we're saying it's a great remembering of what we did at that point of crisis, and we're in a crisis now. We've got multiple pandemics going on, polypandemics. We've got several different forms of environmental crisis, economic crisis, cultural crisis, military crisis going on, and we have to find ways to build resilience, subsistence, and that's through more local, small-based enterprises of every sort. But it has to have the sense of international connection. We have to be able to dismantle the national control, okay, and the way to do that is go back to how it used to be, more local resilience, more local networks, more local entrepreneurs, more local delivery of food items, but it's all locally based, also with seed diversity, seed saving. Everyone needs to compost. Everyone should grow something. Everyone should grow something. Those are the ways towards peace.
Dr. G. Real stories, real people. Unpacking the struggles, reclaiming the narratives with Dr. G.